Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex Andreou. I wanted to mark the anniversary since the awful events that were the catalyst to a year of horror in Israel and Palestine, the likes of which we have not seen in decades, and which has now spilled over that entire region and threatens to destabilize the world. And I wanted to do something that marked not only the 7th of October, that day of horror for Israel, but the days of horror that followed for the people of Palestine. I spoke to Layla Moran yesterday, Liberal Democrat MP and the first of Palestinian descent. Hey Layla.
Hello.
A year ago, did you think this horror was going to last this long?
I really hoped not. I mean, in terms of the scale of the horror, I probably could have predicted it within hours of what we saw happening. I mean, I remember vividly where I was. We were actually at a car boot sale, which is a rare occurrence for us. We've been planning it for months. And I remember getting a text from my father saying, "Look at the news. You won't believe what's happened."
Oh, God.
And I looked, and the scale of it was just so unimaginable. My first thought was, I believe Hamas did it, but I didn't believe they did it on their own. I was convinced Iran was involved and that they were sort of masterminding the whole thing. And as it happens, it was sort of catastrophic success on the part of Hamas, and the fact that Netanyahu was obsessed with policing settlements, etc. And, we'll probably never know the full story. But at the time, all I could think was, hell is about to break loose. But did I think that hell would last this long, and that the international community would prove itself so utterly impotent as to be able to not just abate it, but actually allow it to get worse to the extent that we are now on the brink of a regional conflict? I mean, frankly, it's already spread to the rest of the region. It's just a question of how far that's going to get. No. And I see that as the fault of the international community, and there was much more that our government could and should have done much earlier to stop it from getting to this point.
I think I remember thinking that the reaction, what we saw, would be inversely proportionate to the embarrassment that had been caused to Netanyahu. So I think I also expected it to be big. The pattern in the past had been that these things would flare up and then die down relatively quickly.
Relatively, although there have been, in the moments on the first and second Intifada, there have been times in the past where it has been bad and been bad to the same sort of extent. This is on a completely different level, though. In our history, we will look back at October the 7th, and I think history is still writing itself. But there is still an opportunity for that to have been a positive outcome from a absolutely tragic and horrific beginning.
Why do you think the response from the West has completely failed to adjust to Israel's ratcheting up its behavior? Because that's been the most notable thing to me, that the response at first was a certain amount of leeway was given because of the horror of what happened on the 7th of October. And then Israel kept ratcheting up and up and up, and the West just did nothing.
So first of all, I mean, to the initial response, I think everyone understood that was going to happen, and that must happen, quite rightly. If that has happened to anyone, they would have wanted to do the same. But I think a large part of where this has gone wrong is that I've been struck by how many of my colleagues in Parliament know absolutely nothing about the history of the region, about the makeup of Gaza, where is Gaza, what is Hamas, what is the relationship between Hamas and Iran and the Houthis and Hezbollah, and how this all interplays. It is true that this is, one of the most complex conflicts in the world. And I think where we suffered was policymakers for the last 10 years, by and large, have bought into Netanyahu's narrative of managing the conflict, which we now know, given the ICJ advisory opinion on the occupation, was not in line with international law. That occupation itself was getting more and more stifling to the Palestinian people, but it was in a sense working, because both within Israel, but also in the wider international community, the issue kind of came off the table. And so there were those who were trying to raise the alarm, point out that this is a a tinderbox, and, you know, all it would take is one match and it's likely to go up. And I'm proud to say, when I was Foreign Affairs spokesperson for the Lib Dems back in 2018, we passed policy that kind of recognised that well before this happened. But we saw very little of that kind of activity happening in this country and elsewhere. And I think in part people have been playing catch up, but I think the larger part is America, is politics in America. They are the only ones who have ever had any leverage on Netanyahu. Biden has always been very staunchly pro-Israel, almost blindedly so. And I think in the beginning part of this conflict, they believed him when everyone else was saying, look at who he says he is. You know, you say you want a two-state solution. He has repeatedly ruled that out, not just recently, but before. And it's been so disheartening watching people wake up now saying, oh, I can't believe they've said that they don't want a Palestinian state, and that there are elements within his ministers who actively use genocidal language. But this has been going on for years, and we've been trying to raise the matter. So I think in part it was a little bit of ignorance, a little bit of willful blindedness to what Netanyahu and his very right-wing cabinet were trying to achieve. They did eventually wake up. I think that's clear. But what is still missing is the concerted action. You know, we still don't have a full arms embargo. We still are trading with the settlements, which is just unconscionable. We've issued some sanctions against individuals, but not against people like those extremist ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. You know, there is so much more that we could do, and we haven't.
Layla, is it fair to say that what has emerged is the unpalatable fact that because of its importance as a regional ally, there is no red line, actually, when it comes to Israel? Or do you think there is some sort of excess that might make Western allies say no? I know that's a depressing question.
Goodness. Well, it's a depressing question, but I am always a half glass full person. And I am a liberal because I believe in human rights and the international rule of law. I fundamentally believe in them. And so I have to argue that must be our guiding star. And yes, Israel is a strategic ally and an economic powerhouse within the region. But that said, I think people are now beginning to see that their actions for some time, you know, we're not talking about the ICJ interim case about genocide. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the historic case on occupation, which has been decided that they have been acting illegally for some time. And I think there is a moment now for the West, for those who claim to believe in the international rule of law, to now follow it. And so I think that I'd like to think that is more important than anything else. And when we are seeing the rise of China, Russia rubbing their hands at the perceived hypocrisy of countries like the UK and the US, who are losing legitimacy, not just in other parts of the world, but also with young people in their own country, I hope that the governments can see that must be the main guiding principle, applied without fear or favour. And that's the bit that, you know, we really need to stress. This is not just about Israel and Palestine. This is about how nation states across the entire world, at a time of climate crisis, migration crises, economic crises, huge inequalities, we're going to have to keep working out how to work together. And there is only one, if albeit a very flawed mechanism, and that is the United Nations. And this is a time to bolster those institutions, not undermine them.
Quiet Riot.
Layla, from reports, it seems to me that the population there has almost settled into a new, utterly horrific normal. What is the situation in the Strip at the moment? You still have extended family and friends there.
So my family are originally from Jerusalem. Many are still there. many cousins and so on who are there. In Gaza, my most immediate family are now out. They went to Bahrain. We were very lucky to get them out, and it was very touch and go if we would ever achieve it. For so many other families, it's an impossibility, and I think it's rather shameful that the UK government hasn't set up any kind of reunification scheme, but I'm sorry to say they can't even get out in the first place. So, it's a kind of moot point, frankly. I understand the anger from ordinary people. I understand the anger in Israel. I understand the anger in Palestine. And I think it isn't really fair right now to expect them to be extending olive branches. But there are enormous movements of hope that I think we need to raise the voices of. And when I say enormous, it's the enormous grace they show, but sadly they are few. And there are those within Israel and Palestine, both inside and without, who are saying, from this must not come revenge and repeated cycles of violence. I've become very good friends with some Israelis who are actively calling out Netanyahu, the occupation, the way that they segment Palestinian society in order to divide and conquer, the way they treat political prisoners. There are brave voices within Israel who are calling this out.
We've seen demonstrations within Israel, and although a lot of them are anchored around the fact of wanting the hostages back, there is also a more general dissatisfaction with the way the Netanyahu regime has effectively led us to this moment.
Yeah, I think we are still in the midst of the trauma. And what I had very much hoped for a year on is that, the initial trauma of this bit of the conflict, this sad chapter would be over, but we would have started writing the next one. And while people are still dying, while the hostages are still missing, while we're seeing huge numbers of mothers, children indiscriminately bombed, we can't ask them to be logical yet. But at some point, and I hope there will be brave new leaders, both within Israel and Palestine, and our job here is to help raise those voices, to support them, to show that there are those willing to think differently, to show that those thoughts are valued in the international community and that can resonate. What little influence we have must be to those who want an end to the cycles of violence. And I say frequently, people say, pick a side. Are you on the side of Israel or are you on the side of Palestine? And if you accept that a two-state solution is the only way out of this, and there are arguments to say it isn't, but I just don't buy them. Even if you did want a singular secular state with full democratic rights for everyone, I do think a two-state solution is the halfway post to that. I think we need to focus on the achievable. And if you are on the side of a two-state solution and peace, then that's the side I'm on. And I don't care where you might come from, what your heritage is, or what you believe otherwise. If you are against that, then you are on the side of continued violence, segregation, and not believing in international human rights and international law. And those are the sides, peace or not. It's actually quite simple.
Layla, I'm curious. I've seen some signs both of support within the Strip getting stronger for Hamas because of everything that's going on. But I've also seen some signs of blame being assigned to Hamas for having played a part as the catalyst to the last year. What's your sense? Is support for the Hamas leadership in the Strip waning or getting stronger?
So, as often is the case, experience of a leader makes you less inclined to like them. So, my understanding from the polling that has been done, and there are some incredible academics who are doing proper, normalized polling, even within Gaza. And of course, they cannot ask Hamas for permission because Hamas will then gerrymander the numbers and who they get to speak to. And it's incredibly reliable. On the face of it, it is true to say that when people say, are you supportive of what Hamas did or not, that increased following October the 7th. And then those were what the headlines were all about. But they asked a series of questions after that point, including, do you think it's okay to murder innocent people? And the answer was no, of course not. But the point they were making was that Hamas did something in the context of more than a decade of Palestine and the question of self-determination and two states being completely left off the table, also at an international level. So that seems to be what the polling was suggesting was going on behind the thinking. It's not that they suddenly think Hamas had lost a huge amount of support before October the 7th, particularly in Gaza, because like so many ideologically driven political movements who then take over local administration, they were corrupt. They were really bad at getting the bins done. It was the basics that they were getting wrong. And so people didn't like them at all. So we've just got to be so careful. The sort of generalization of has support increased or decreased or whatever. There is no future for peace in Palestine with Hamas at the helm. That is clear. And even Hamas know that. And it's in part why they are choosing, with Netanyahu, at points to perpetuate the war, because it's in their own interest. So we've got to just be very careful, I think, with the sort of broad generalizations.
Yeah.
And I also, as I said earlier, have a huge amount of compassion for the anger. The anger of people. And when people are angry, they don't reach for the logical conclusions. They don't see that by supporting those extremist views, whether in Israel or Palestine, that actually that makes the problem worse. They're being offered the simple solution, and that's soothing at a time that they bloody need soothing. So while that's happening, I think we kind of need to not judge too much because we aren't there. Instead, do what we can, which is to focus on those who are beginning to see the light through the darkness, who are on the ground, and to push our governments to do better, be better, and realize that if they are serious about delivering two states and having peace, as Keir Starmer claims to do, then they need a better answer to the question I asked him in the House this week, which is what is he personally doing to make that happen? And I got a completely non-answer.
Layla, one final question. How are you? Sometimes it's easy to focus on the horror that's going on over there, but there is also an expatriate Palestinian community. And the wait for news while you watch this horrific reports and the powerlessness must be just utterly exhausting. Have you found that the support network over here has sprung into place, that maybe you have found the Palestinian community, that you have cleaved closer to each other?
We have. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what's happened. And one of the successes of Palestinians there's a huge diaspora. There are more Palestinians outside of Palestine than there are in, because many parents over the years, including my own family, decided it was safer to take the children out.
Yeah.
But our cultural identity remains very strong, with the hope that one day we'd be able to go back and invest and show our own children that incredible land that we are still very much a part of. But we're also incredibly resourceful. You often don't know you're dealing with a Palestinian. And I was just struck how people are much more open to say, yeah, I'm from Palestine, or I have a link to Palestine. I was, I'll share with you, before the election, I was in hospital for a while and ended up having to have an emergency operation. My surgeon was from Gaza. He'd been here 10 years, 15 years even, I think he said. He'd been, working in the NHS. His family are here. They are growing up in Kent. It's the most incredible person, contributing to British society. And I would bet most of his colleagues didn't even know he was working in the same hospital as them. So I think we've learned now that we do need to pull together, support each other. And if there are any silver linings, it's the new friends that I've made. And, recognizing that you don't know what you've got till it's potentially going to go. I can't tell you that ICJ application for genocide, and I'm not preempting what the court's going to say, because it is, as a matter of international law, an incredibly complex subject.
Very, very.
But as a human, to know that your people are the subject of a case like that, and that it's even being heard, let alone what might come next. I can't even begin to tell you what that has felt like. And what springs from it is an absolute determination that we must make a Palestinian state happen within my lifetime, because if we don't, no one else is going to.
Sometimes out of the terror, a new settlement can emerge.
It will.
Things can change, and they can change quickly. That we know. Thank you, Layla. I wish you better news soon, and I wish all your nearest and dearest back home the very best.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me and talking about it. We've got to keep talking about it. Thank you.
Two things struck me in that conversation. The first is how measured, how deliberate Layla is throughout. The sometimes audible effort that she makes to avoid strident binary grandstanding, to see things through the other side's eyes, to understand why others may find it hard to be compassionate. It seems to me that many self-proclaimed allies of Palestine who seek to inflame at every stage, even though that is plainly counterproductive because it feeds their own sense of moral superiority, could learn a lot from her approach. The second is how hopeful she is, that out of this horror something better might emerge, how she challenged my own depressed fatalism and sense of powerlessness. As someone from a nation that survived a 4th-century Ottoman occupation, to spring up again with its language, culture and identity, not just intact, but stronger, I am reminded of the words of Greece's Nobel-winning poet, Odysseus Elitis. If you smashed Greece to pieces, you would be left with an olive tree, a grapevine and a fishing boat. From those 3 things you could also put Greece back together. And it occurs to me that Palestinians abroad, like Layla, are the key to that optimism, because it means that a free Palestine is an idea that cannot be suppressed within a geographical location or flattened by missiles. It exists in the hearts of a 6 million strong diaspora.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Oh, gosh.
Thanks, Alex.
Oh, my sweetheart. I'm so... It is so horrible. Oh, God. Right. All right. I hope you have a good Freshers' Fair. That will be reviving, right? To be with all those young things, full of hopes and full of idealism. That's what we need.